understand here. So we'll trace how the Chinese interacted with these ideas, and we'll understand why the Qing dynasty resisted these reforms for so long and was destroyed shortly after it accepted them. So one problem I want us to get us to see, this is always the case with any kind of reform, right? I mean, their particular case was how do we respond to the growing power of the West? But they also have to decide, what are our weaknesses? What is it that needs to be reformed? How much should we reform? And even if we reform, what should it look like? And you can imagine people are going to disagree a lot about that, right? Some people will say, well, we need to go back to tradition. That's the problem. Other people say, no, we need to change tradition. And then there's this problem, who are we? The Manchus think in terms of what's good for the Manchus. Some people have a loyalty to the Qing and think about what's good for the Qing. Others think what's good for the Han Chinese, right? Who is this we? Which comes first, right? Does my place, does my ethnicity come first? Does my belief in Confucianism come first? What comes first? What is most important? Saving the Qing, saving Confucian nation, or saving the Chinese? Saving Confucian civilization, or saving the Chinese nation? And I gave you as an example this guy, Zheng Guofan, where Zheng Guofan is responding to the Taiping Rebellion. He was a provincial official, not a central official, but because the central government of the Qing Empire was so weak by this time, they had to depend on this guy to raise taxes and his own army himself. So imagine, again, if the mayor of Greenwood, there was a rebellion in Greenwood, and the state and federal government couldn't do anything about it. And they had to ask the mayor of Greenwood, give him permission to collect special taxes so he could raise an army. That's what's going on. The Qing were lucky that this guy was loyal. And this guy, he's if you want to understand like someone who really believed in Confucianism, who was basically incorruptible, was this guy. This is one reason why he's respected today even in China. But the key thing is he wants to restore tradition. He wants to restore the Confucian gentry government alliance. He's fighting for the Qing and Confucianism. Right? That's his primary identity. I am a person of the Qing. The Qing is the one thing that can protect Confucian civilization. Kangxi did his work very well, didn't he? Right? That he would make that connection. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that this guy, even though he's working for conservative ends, he wants to restore the Qing Empire to its former glory. He's willing to borrow from the West. Remember, he was given this letter on self-strengthening that argued that we should make China stronger, the Qing stronger, by studying foreign language, math, and science. And he will support that. And he will even write a preface to a math textbook that was translated by missionaries. He will start importing weapons and machines from abroad. He'll help establish an arsenal. And we call all this self-strengthening. This idea that we can, through the importation of Western technology, strengthen our government, strengthen our society. We don't have to change politics, don't have to change society, we just need better stuff. It starts off with military stuff, but it will include new types of transportation like railroads and communication like telegraph, because you need that to have an effective military. This, by the way, is different from the traditional rich country, strong army. Right? They're following a slightly different kind of policy here. Like I said, it does not include political changes. The basic idea is that Confucian Qing is basically good. It just needs some modern technology. But even this had people who opposed it. And we ended with this quote from Wu Ren, a Qing official who was Mongolian, not Han Chinese. Remember, Mongolia is a part of the Qing Empire. And this guy says, nope, don't want any of this stuff. No barbarians as teachers, no Western technology, no learning about math, because math is for chumps. You can't learn anything useful from math. Come on. Plotting the trajectory of a cannon, that's pointless. I'm being sarcastic. So this is a problem, right? Even this limited reform, there's opposition. Now, a lot of this is happening through Western contact. Right? A lot of this is happening through Western contact. And again, this is complex, how this works. So there's a guy named Robert Hart. Remember how we talked about customs and tariffs? Or when goods come into your country, you can charge a tax. We call it either a custom or a tariff. And those things are very important because you use the money from those taxes to do things like build roads, improve harbors, build up your infrastructure, raise an army, all those wonderful things. Remember that the Qing Empire had lost the Opium War and were forced to have low tariffs. Right, remember that? They were not allowed to raise their tariffs very high. They had low tariffs. And what ended up happening was a man from Northern Ireland named Sir Robert Hart, so he's part of the British Empire. He will actually organize the Qing Imperial Maritime Customs Services. So he's the one in charge of collecting the tax. What's neat about Sir Robert Hart, you know how there's like all these stereotypes about like bad bureaucrats, like they don't do anything right, and they're just concentrating on bickering rather than doing their jobs? He's the exact opposite. He's the example of a good bureaucrat. Even though he was British, he worked very hard to do his job correctly. He made sure that this collected money efficiently. He made sure to try and destroy corruption. One thing, for example, was that he would not let any of his workers work in one place for too long. He was always transferring workers. So that way they couldn't become too involved with local people and get bribed. Right, so he was very much obsessed with making this system work. And he made it work for the good of the Qing. The Qing respected this guy. And Chinese people would often call him our Hart. Right, Sir Robert Hart, he's our Hart. So even though he was British, he was still working for the Qing Empire. And the Qing, it's not that they understood that he also had loyalties to Britain, but he was an honest man. And he was incorruptible. And he worked hard. And this benefited the Qing. Right? You may remember this from the comic. Right? Remember the land taxes? We talked about how that was the highest. It's not going up. Like from 1850 to 1910, it stays almost the same. It goes up like 10%. It goes up 3 by 3. But look at the customs taxes that Sir Robert Hart is collecting. That's a huge amount of revenue that by the fall of the Qing dynasty is more than the land tax. Imagine what would happen if they could have raised the tariffs. Remember, the treaty stopped them from having high tariffs. Imagine how much money they could have had. Remember we talked about earlier, a lot of the problems of the empire would have gone away if they had more money. Right? Remember we talked about that previously. Right? They were in this kind of death spiral where they didn't have enough money to take care of the farmers, to defend things, so they start fighting with the people over resources. If they could have gotten this fixed earlier, right, they would have had even more money. Without Hart, they would have been in trouble. Right? The empire wouldn't have even lasted as long as it did. So again, we had these complex relationships with the West. In one side, this hurts China, right, because they can't raise tariffs like they would like, but the other side, it gives them a new revenue stream that will be used to fund a lot of what the government's doing. The Qing will also operate will develop in 1861. Notice, again, I'm not strict about years, but I do want you to understand cause. Remember, they lose the Second Opium War in 1860. In 1861, they established this thing called the Zhongli Yamen. Right, the Zhongli Yamen. Yamen just means like government office. But the idea of the Zhongli Yamen was this was a special office for dealing with the West politically. One thing that's very interesting about how the Chinese organized diplomacy was traditionally they went through what was called the Board of Rites, like the Board of Rituals. So that showed, and the idea was they went through the Board of Rituals because you were supposed to ritualistically kowtow to the emperor. But they're realizing that's not working. So the Qing is dynamic. They're willing to reform, and the Zhongli Yamen is an example of that. They build this new government institution to better handle relations with the West after they are so defeated so badly in the Second Opium War. So there is reform, right? They're willing to learn from the West, to take advantage of things from the West that work well, and even develop positive working relationships with people like Robert Hart. Just as a quick side, one thing I love about Robert Hart, for you music fans, he was paid very well, and he invested his money in a brass band. I believe it was made up of Chinese people. So he had like this Chinese brass band, and he would throw parties, and he would have his own brass band play at the party. So he's a cool guy. Right? I mean, if you get rich, that's a great thing to invest your money in. It's your own orchestra or band. To give you another example, though, the Zhongli Yamen, missionaries will help translate texts on international law. One thing, you can kind of think about it this way, right? The law is complex. And anytime someone mentions, like, we're going to hire a lawyer, it's like, oh, this is scary, right? Because you know that, and it's like, I better hire a lawyer too, because I don't know the law well. Well, the Chinese were in that kind of situation because Europeans were constantly saying, well, according to international law, this is how we're supposed to do things. And the Europeans understood international law well, the Chinese didn't. So Europeans and later Americans and the Japanese were able to take advantage of the Chinese because they didn't know international law. Well, a group of missionaries working with the Chinese translated texts on international law into Chinese. These guys started reading it, and they started using the international law effectively. Right? So there's one case the Germans said, oh, according to international law, we have the right to do this. See paragraph 3. And then the Chinese say back, oh yes, but in paragraph 3, section 4, article 2, it says in this circumstance, section 3 doesn't work. And the Germans like, the Chinese learned something. So again, the Chinese are learning, they're reforming. They're learning about international law, they're developing new institutions to deal with it. And a lot of this, as I mentioned, is coming through missionaries. Right? If you're a Chinese person and you want to learn about the West, probably the best way to do it without going to the West is to talk to a missionary. They're the ones who are most likely to know Chinese. Right? If you are a merchant or a politician in China from Britain or America, you probably don't know Chinese. It's not required until much later that you would actually learn the language. But the missionaries, in order to do their work, had to learn Chinese. Now the Catholics are still active, Catholics are still around, but I'm going to focus on Protestants because they're the primary group here. They're the ones who are going to be the most active. Catholics are still there, don't think that they've been replaced. It's just, this isn't a class on religion, so I'm going to talk about people who are, in a sense, more significant historically here. That's the Protestants. So Protestant Christianity is going to grow in China, especially after the Second Opium War. Right? In the First Opium War, they get permission to have missionaries in China. After the Second Opium War, they're allowed to go inland. So after the Second Opium War, missionaries can go wherever they want. What's going to happen then is that these missionaries, and I have to emphasize Protestants here, these missionaries are mostly what we would call Anglo-American missionaries, or Anglophone. They're mostly Americans, British people, people from Australia, people from Canada. They share a tradition of liberal democracy. Right? They share a tradition of liberal democracy. And if you were to ask them, what made Britain so powerful? What made the United States so powerful? They would say, Protestant Christianity made them so powerful. They believe very strongly that ideas of Protestant freedom help make those countries powerful. So today, when you think of like Christianity, you think of, okay, if someone says I'm a Christian, that means they believe certain things about Jesus. It's true that that's what they believe in this era too, but they also think it says certain things about politics and civilization. Right? Why are you can think about, during this time period, the most powerful countries were Great Britain and the United States, followed by Germany and France. They're all Christian. Russia is in there too. The most powerful are Protestant primarily. So when they come into China, they're not just bringing a gospel of believe in Jesus Christ so you can go to heaven. They also bring in an idea of Western civilization, of liberal democracy and science. They bring in this idea that, you know what? It's okay, especially if you're British, it's okay to have a king, but you still should vote, and you should have like a parliament. And they also bring in ideas, a lot of them bring in science. They will also be translating texts. They're like the Catholics in that sense. These are often the chief translators for Western ideas. Remember, I already mentioned a math textbook that was translated by a missionary, and I mentioned a book on international law that was translated by a missionary. So they're very important for bringing in new ideas. Very similar to what the Catholics did. Right? Very similar. Catholics do a little bit of this, but they don't have the money that the Protestants do. That's one reason. They're also often critics of China. Right? They're also often critics of China. And this can be good and bad. It's bad sometimes because they go too far, but in other cases it's quite good because they point to areas where China could develop, where China could reform. So, as a historian, I want to point out that these missionary contact could have positive and negative impact on Chinese culture and civilization. So one thing I have to emphasize, when Protestant Christians come, they don't just think about salvation in terms of heaven. They also think about how do we improve society. Right? A lot of these are evangelical Christians who have a very positive view of what happens when you become a Christian. They think once you become a Christian, you have moral reform, you completely transform society. They're very optimistic. So one thing that they try and do is they try and build institutions. They're not just there to convert people to Christianity. They also build institutions, primarily hospitals and schools. So they don't just send people who are theologically trained. They send medical doctors, including women who are medical doctors. Right, so there'll be female medical doctors here. And of course they establish schools. So if you're Chinese and you want to learn about the West, you don't have to go there. You go to one of these schools. Yeah, Chris?
But they were Western schools.
Right.
Confucian, China.
Exactly. Right, and you raise an important point, which we'll come back to, but you're doing some good foreshadowing here, right? Some Chinese won't like that. We'll come back to that, but good point. So they will learn Chinese, and what will happen is the missionaries will learn Chinese, so they can teach the Chinese, but they will also teach Western languages. And that's very important because they also make personal connections. Right? Their schools aren't necessarily large. They get close to the students. They want to see the students do well, just like the professors at Lander, right? So they will often arrange for them to travel to the West as students. So they will give Chinese people new opportunities. So for example, Ida Kahn and Mary Stone, this is Mary Stone right here, I only want you to remember her, one of the first female Chinese doctors. She goes to a missionary school, converts to Christianity. They see that she's really smart, and they arrange for her to go to the West and study in the United States, where she gets a medical degree and then comes back to China. So in many ways, these missionaries are opening up new opportunities to Chinese people, learning about new knowledge. Yes, Dylan?
I didn't think at this time Western governments allow women to be doctors.
I think it depends on the country, but I think by the late 19th century, I think most do.
Okay.
Right? It depends on the rule. And it also gets complex because the way they defined medical doctor was different than the way we do. But I do know that in the United States, women could become medical doctors by this time. And that's where she goes. At the same time, there's also conflict and misunderstanding. Right? So in history, seldom is anything just 100% positive or 100% negative. So remember we talked about how this, the drowning girls in China, that there was this tradition of infanticide. People didn't just kill infants they did not think they could take care of. They would sometimes abandon them. And the reason you abandon them is you hope that someone else will pick them up. That's the idea. But the problem is, and I'm going to turn off the light so you can maybe see this a little bit better. The problem is sometimes animals get to the children first. Right? You can see in this image, there's a pig trying to get the baby. There's a dog trying to get the baby. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes no animal gets there, but the child just dies. Right? If you leave an infant out on the ground for a while, they will eventually die. So what happened was, among Catholic missionaries in particular, there was a desire to protect these children, to help them. I don't want to go too much into doctrine, but if you're a Protestant Christian, you usually believe in something called believer's baptism. So like you have to be like age of reason. That's a Catholic term, sorry. You have to be old enough to make a choice for yourself. I know Catholic theology a lot better than I do Protestant theology, sorry. So like, you have to be old enough that you can say, yes, I make a choice for Jesus, and then you may be baptized, right? That's like how Baptists generally do things. Catholics believe that that baptism is a literal washing from sin, and you can wash someone from sin whether they make a decision or not, which is why Catholics baptize babies, right? Just as you would give a baby a bath to clean dirt off them, you can also clean spiritual dirt off them, so they baptize babies. And the Catholic Church says, we don't really know what happens to unbaptized babies, but it's better if they're baptized. So what happened was French missionaries in particular would try and raise money so they could use that money to hire people to go out and pick up abandoned babies. And then they would baptize them. And of course, the ones that die, they will hopefully have a good afterlife. The ones who survive, well, they go to a Catholic orphanage. Right? And a lot of them are girls, and then they hope that they'll marry men, and the men will convert to Catholicism. That's kind of it's humanitarian, but also they're hoping this will lead to the expansion of Catholicism. So this is what these Catholics were doing. The Chinese thought it was really weird. Right? You're picking up all these kids, and you're performing this ritual on them, and after you perform the ritual on them, a lot of them die. Now, it's not the Catholics' fault that they're dying. They're dying because they were maybe abandoned there for a couple days before they picked them up. But Catholics, from the perspective of the Chinese, are behaving strangely. And the Chinese don't really differentiate much between Catholics and Protestants. If you're a Chinese person and you're not a Christian, they look the same to you, for the most part. So what happens is this helps give these Christians engage in these practices that make sense from a Christian perspective, don't make sense from a Chinese perspective. And so this leads to rumors, right? Why are these Catholics so interested in these kids? Why do they perform these rituals? Why do so many of those kids die? And some Chinese will argue that the Western people actually need to collect the organs of children for medicine. Right? And they say, you know how those Western people have cameras? You know how the cameras like take an image? They need people's eyes to make cameras. Right? There arose this rumor. And there was rumors, and this is like a Chinese book, anti-Christian book, saying that the Catholics need the baby's organs to make medicine. And so they're tearing open this Chinese woman to take her baby. Now here's the thing. Christians didn't do this in China. But remember, Christian people are also often behaving badly. So it's not hard for Chinese people to believe this. Right? When you invade the country, when you go out and you challenge traditions, people will believe anything. Right? Remember, Westerners are saying, don't worship your ancestors. The Chinese, that seems horrible. So if you have people saying, don't worship your ancestors, it's not hard for them to believe they're doing terrible things. And this will lead, I'm just giving you an example, of Tianjin, the Tianjin massacre of 1870. Tianjin is a city in China. There, you will have a Chinese riot that will kill 19 Westerners, including 10 Catholic nuns. Right? And this results for a lot of reasons. One is because the nuns were doing this kind of thing. And people noticed that their graveyard had the graves of a lot of babies. The nuns weren't killing the babies were just sick when they brought them in and they died. But, they interpret it this way. And like I said, Western people were not necessarily behaving well. So if you have people who are behaving badly, and then they engage in weird practices, you're going to interpret them negatively. And also, and this goes to what Chris was bringing up later, Christianity was challenging gentry power. Remember, the gentry's power comes from Confucianism. This is often emphasized through rituals like ancestor rites. Christians don't do those things and are told not to. And they say it's bad. And Christian knowledge is different from Confucian knowledge. It often emphasizes technical knowledge over moral knowledge in many cases. And when they do emphasize morality, it's Christian morality, not Confucian morality. So the Christians are a challenge to the gentry power. They're a challenge to Confucianism. Yes, Tyler?
Well, I mean, this is like a while back, probably in '09, but is it still today, like Christianity is still limited over in China? Like, you're allowed to, like, bring, like, say, one Bible, but you can't bring a set?
I'm not sure the exact rules now. There was definitely a time when that was the case. It's complex. And I could give a really, really long answer. What I would say is remember, China often faced religious rebellions, and in China historically, remember, there's no church and state. The emperor is the high priest. So politics dominates state. So from the Chinese perspective, it makes sense to try and control religion. Though curiously, right now, I think there's been a deal worked out between Beijing and the Pope so they can agree to nominate certain people to be bishops. And a lot of times people enjoy a lot of practical religious freedom, though officially the government's in charge. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they would maybe preserve the right to do that, though interestingly enough, the biggest publisher of Bibles in the world is a government-run publishing house in China. So it's complex. That means they can make sure that people have the correct Bibles. It's complex. In addition, while some Chinese who converted to Christianity really believed in the religion, others converted into it to get close to powerful Western people. Oh, that Western missionary is very powerful. The government does what it says. It's afraid to make them angry. My neighbor and I are in a lawsuit together. I'm going to become a Christian to get that missionary to help me out. And that happened a lot. Happened enough that it gave Christianity a bad reputation. And I want to stress there were a lot of sincere Chinese Christians. You can see that because a lot of them will die rather than give up their faith. But there were some Chinese who converted to Christianity just to get access to Western power. My buddies with the power, if I'm a Christian, got a powerful missionary who will help me out. Now here's the thing. When this happens, what can the Qing do? The Chinese people say, look, these Westerners are behaving terribly. They're doing terrible things. That's why we killed them. Get rid of these Western people. The Western governments are like, what gives? You guys just let all these criminals kill our people. They killed a bunch of nuns. You don't kill nuns. Punish these people. So what's the Qing government supposed to do? It can't make both sides happy. So the Qing government, after getting beaten up in the Second Opium War, realizes it can't defeat the Westerners, so it punishes the Chinese people. And it pays money to the Westerners. So what's going to happen, of course, the Chinese people are more and more saying, who is this government that won't protect us, that allows these Christians to come in and do terrible things and won't defend us? Instead, punishes us. So you can see that kind of alienation growing. Okay, so before we continue, a few announcements. The review quiz and reading quiz 5 are due by Sunday, 11:59 p.m. Remember, the reading quiz is Lu Xun's The True Story of IQ. And remember, I said I try to emphasize that as a difficult work, so give yourself plenty of time to study it. I will not have office hours today. I apologize. I have to go take my wife to physical therapy, but I will have extended office hours on Thursday, 9:30 to 2:30. Want to see your exam? Please do come. We will hopefully start Section 6 on Monday. Sorry, I wrote those in a hurry, so I made a grammatical mistake. The exam grades I was overall very happy. with the grades. They were high, so that made me happy. Just a couple things to note. On the matching, if you weren't happy with the matching, remember I do give you a list of terms in these study guides. So if you have trouble with the matching, make sure you're looking at that terms list. And I always try and bold them, right? So Mary Stone, I put her in bold, I want you to remember her name. So I always try and do that. I encourage people to make note cards. That can help you to review, to make sure you understand them. And the big thing, just think about how I wrote this. I would write emperor who, official who. So note on the note card their job and their significance. Right? If you can at least remember the person's an emperor, that helps you some, at least. Remember the person's a communist or nationalist, that will help you. And I saw a lot of people did listen to the recorded review, so that made me happy. But if you didn't listen to that and you weren't happy with your grade, I would encourage you to do that. Right? Listen to the recorded review. The one other area where I think there could be a lot of improvement, though, was the essays, because I gave you the essay ahead of time, right? So that's one thing where a lot of people lost points because they just didn't give me enough, if that makes sense. Remember, the answer's supposed to be accurate and comprehensive. And you may say, well, how can I do that? There's limited time. The more you prepare, the easier it will be to write because you've already done your thinking. So just to give you an example, and I put this together in like 2 minutes. One of the questions was about how the relations with the West were transformed. I said, okay, we had this early period with Macau and the Catholics and Matteo Ricci and science and math and Yuan Mignon and all that wonderful stuff. And then also later on, trade comes into the picture. Remember in Canton, we had these positive relationships between Chinese merchants and Western merchants. There were some frustrations. We saw that in the McCartney mission, but trade was progressing. However, because of the problems that came out of the imbalance of trade, the British will turn to opium. That will lead to war and to unequal treaties. Then in part 4, I mentioned how that then leads to these treaty ports where the Westerners have command, they have sovereignty. And it's shameful for the Chinese, they're upset about that, but at the same time, it lets the Chinese learn about Western things and have some freedom, right? You could actually, authors like Lu Xun will go to treaty port areas because they'll be safe there. This is especially an area where, and I don't think anyone did this, you want to integrate the readings. So remember, we read, there was a bunch of stuff about how the treaty ports were helpful. Remember all the stuff about Shanghai, the pictorial, the newspapers and all that? That's an area that you could have brought that in. And finally, we talked about going on with the treaty ports, how that led to Hong Xiuquan to learn about Christianity, led to the Taiping Rebellion. But the Westerners say, oh, we don't like the Taiping. They believe in a strange Christianity. And the Qing have signed a treaty with us, so let's support the Qing. Now, my point of this, of course, notice how I've got it divided into 5 points. You could remember 5 points very easily, and that can help you write and organize your essay. That's just something to think about. And the idea is also, if you weren't happy with your grade, either on the essay or just in total, doing this helps you to understand. Right? One thing, especially for those of you who are not historians we're trying to tell a story. It's often a complex story, but we're trying to tell a story. So I pick facts that are meant to tell a story. And if you can remember how the facts fit into a story, then you understand the facts better. If you just remember a bunch of facts, it's like memorizing a phone book. It's not particularly useful. But if you remember the story, it's easier to remember everything, right? How it all fits together. So I just want to point that out. That's something I would encourage you to do. But come have a look at your test, and I can go over the essay and talk about ways to improve it. So any questions there?
When will your office hours be in?
I will have office hours tomorrow, 9:30 to 2:30, and also afternoon on Friday till 1 p.m.
Okay.
But none today. All thanks. So one thing I want to talk in this class, I want us to understand that China and Chinese people are not just in China, they're of course here in the United States, right? Either as international students, but also we have a large number of Chinese Americans, right? People whose ancestors may have immigrated to the United States in the 19th century. So, and this is a good point to mark that, right? Where we have this kind of interchange, right? We have Western people now in China in large numbers. Now we're going to start having large numbers of Chinese in the West. And I want to focus on the United States. To do that, though, you maybe have heard of this. This is kind of a joke, but it's real. A teacher gave this assignment to their students. You are to assume the role of a Chinese immigrant in 1870. This is a high school teacher. And write a letter home describing your experiences. Your letter should include the following: your contributions and experience in the West. And then someone uploaded an example of the assignment, which looked like this. They wrote Chinese. You're a Chinese person in the 19th century. So they wrote in Chinese. Now, I thought that this was all a joke. I thought the kid was playing a joke, but it turns out that this is what's wonderful about the internet. The teacher who gave the assignment actually learned about it. And the teacher, it turned out, I believe she was in New York. I think she was in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember if it's Brooklyn or not. But I believe she's in New York. And she had a dual language high school class with a lot of Chinese kids in it who had just immigrated from China. And she had to teach them U.S. history. And she was trying to think out, how can I get these Chinese people interested in U.S. history? This is how. So the kid was actually completing the assignment correctly. So you were allowed to write the assignment in Chinese, but it is funny. But this is the translation. I'm not doing well over here. The working conditions are bad and there are little benefits, but don't worry about me. Only 10 people a day die, or only 10 people a day are seriously injured, and I'm very careful. Business isn't too good. Although I do not understand English too well, I can roughly understand what the white people are saying. I hope that I can make a name for myself. I'll work hard over here and I'll take good care of myself. Are you doing well? I miss you guys a lot and hope that we'll all be able to do that soon. Oh, that was funny. By the way, the same website also has this, which I think is the funniest thing ever. Draw a plant cell and identify its most important parts. Iron bars, no windows. Label something that's not there. And that's the saddest looking days ever. So I now want to play a clip for you that's going to talk a little bit about the Chinese in the United States. Right? We want to understand that this is a two-way trip.
And many of these people stay, right?
To the United States, they were seen as a welcome addition to the workforce, building the infrastructure of the West Coast.
However, by the 1870s, when an economic recession set in and unemployment became an issue, the Chinese were blamed and scapegoated for being unfair economic competition by white workers. And it was the white workers who spearheaded this anti-Chinese movement to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that would stop them from coming to the United States. Aside from having a detrimental impact on the numbers of Chinese in the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act created a bachelor society. There were very few women here. In fact, the sex ratio of Chinese men to Chinese women was as high as 20-1. Men would engage in gambling, go to the brothels, and create lucrative underground activities. And these social vices were facilitated with the organization of Tongs, which were secret societies of men who engaged in illegal activities. The Chinese Exclusion Act marked the first time in American history that the United States moved from open immigration to restrictive and exclusive immigration. The population of the Chinese dropped from 100,000 to 60,000 in the next 40 years. And that meant that the Chinese American community was stifled.
While the act was officially repealed in 1943, it wasn't until 1965 that immigration quotas for Chinese citizens were finally eliminated.
And we had to drop it in 1943 because that was when China was our ally in the war against Japan. So one thing we want to stress, remember we were talking about how the economic situation in China was getting worse in the 19th century. So many Chinese were looking to immigrate. Many are going to Southeast Asia, right? Places like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Incidentally, I mentioned in class 4, my wife is Filipino. Her grandfather was half Chinese, right? And he was one of these immigrants, right? So our kids are like 1/16 Chinese, I think. My math's not good. But in any case, there's this pressure on Chinese to immigrate. Many are going to Southeast Asia, but a lot are also going to go to the United States, right? You had the gold rush in 1849. They will sometimes refer to the United States as Gold Mountain, right? So a lot of Chinese will go to the United States there. And of course, especially in the, I think it's 1860s and 70s, right? You have the building of the Transcontinental Railway, trying to build this railway across the entire United States. And a lot of the laborers who do that are Chinese. And that's during kind of a boom time, but later there's a recession, as they mentioned in the clip, and that's going to lead to a decrease, or that's going to lead, when there's a labor demand and wages are pretty good, it's fine, But what happens when there's a recession, people are going to say, oh, it's the Chinese fault, they're competing, they're lowering wages, let's get rid of the Chinese. Right? So you're going to have this kind of pressure to try to exclude Chinese people in order to preserve wages and jobs. That's kind of the goal. And that will lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So what this means then is that Chinese will have a very mixed experience with the West. On one side, many Chinese will come to make lives in the United States and will be happy there, they'll find equal opportunity, but there's also negatives, right? They face racism. And so there's this difficult situation where many Chinese people will say, the United States has a good government. Like, we would like to have more democracy, but wow, is this a racist society? right? And one thing we'll mention later, initially the Chinese wanted to send students to the United States, but we were just too racist, so they decided to send them to Europe instead. Right? So there's these kind of issues. And I'm kicking myself because I forgot to add it. Believe it or not, I think there were 3 Chinese men who fought in the American Civil War. Right? There were 3 Chinese men. There's one guy, I got his, a long time ago, I got his pension records from the United States government. This Chinese guy who, he was a slave who was bought in Canton by a guy from Vermont who brought him home to the United States, and slavery's illegal in Vermont. He educated the guy. The guy became very anti-slavery, I guess, and joined the Union side during the Civil War, and married a white lady and had kids. So it's kind of interesting, kind of a history note. But there was only like 3 guys, so they didn't have that much of an impact. But it's interesting. Okay. So we now need to talk to understand. So you notice how I've been talking about emperors a lot. Like there's a whole bunch of emperors in that first section. We're not going to talk a lot about emperors. We're going to talk a lot though about this woman Cixi, because what happens is after the Second Opium War, there's an emperor who's in charge, and he's a strong emperor. But after him, there's no real strong emperors anymore. Right? So after 1861, there's really no strong emperors. There are 2 emperors I want you to know that we'll talk about later, but they're both weak. So the days of strong emperors are gone. So we have weak emperors and a power vacuum. Remember, China is an authoritarian system where the emperor holds all this power. And things don't work without the emperor. So you need someone to be in charge. And the person who's going to step in is a woman named Cixi. Now when people think of her, this is often what they think of her, right? This is the Empress Dowager. They think of her when she's an older lady. But she's in power for like 50 years. So she didn't always look like, she wasn't always an old lady. Right? She was often very, during this period, she was often in her prime. But she will start off as a consort, like a concubine of the emperor. And she's just really smart. And the emperor really likes her. And so she will eventually become the Empress Dowager. Right? Empress Dowager is like the mother of an emperor. Right? When you add the dowager, it means you're the mother of an emperor. And so what will happen then, in 1875, the emperor will die, and her son Guangxu, or I'm sorry, actually, I believe it's her nephew. Tanya, am I right? It's nephew, right?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's not her son, it's her nephew. Her nephew, Guangxu, will rise to power. Again, I'm not too strict on years, but notice this happens in 1875. That's the year he was born. So he's like 4 years old. So that means she is effectively emperor of China. Right? She's ruling through her 4-year-old nephew. And it's her nephew, it's not her kid. Right? So she doesn't really care that much. So you have this power vacuum of weak emperors, and this woman Cixi is going to come in and try and run things. Now Cixi, and one thing I want to stress, this woman is smart. Right? You don't get in this kind of position of power without being smart. So she is a smart lady. In many ways, she does a good job of holding China together. Certainly better than the Wan Li emperor. But the problem is, her basic approach is she wants to prove some self-strengthening, but she doesn't want to do anything at all that will weaken the power of the Manchu. Remember, she is Manchu. The emperor is Manchu. She wants her ethnic group to stay in power. She wants the Qing to stay in power. And anything that would weaken them, she's opposed to. So remember, we talked about this problem. Who are we? She doesn't care so much about the Chinese nation as an ethnic group. She cares about the Manchu ethnic group and maintaining the Qing Empire. That's her primary goal. Now sometimes that agrees with people. Remember Zheng Guofan? He wants to maintain the Qing Empire because he believes in the old Confucian system. So their interests align perfectly. Or I shouldn't do it. Their interests align perfectly. But later, Chinese will be angry at her because she's going to stop reforms that might make China stronger, but that weaken the Manchu. So for example, she does not want any kind of democracy. Even a constitutional monarchy like Britain, she does not want, because that would weaken the power of the emperors. So she opposes anything democratic. We now need to talk about another self-strengthener, a student of Zheng Guofan, a man named Li Hongzhang. Li Hongzhang is one of my favorite people. He's another guy like Zheng Guofan, one of these incorruptible officials. He was trusted by Cixi. He was loyal to the empire and was very, very competent. This guy knew what he was doing. He was a self-strengthener. So he's going to develop things like arsenals, steamships, And he realizes that you can't have a good army without a stronger economy. So he will develop coal mines. Right? Steamships require coal. Railroads require coal. Factories require coal. So we need to develop China's resources. He will even develop a cotton mill, both to make uniforms and to make money. So you can see self-strengthening is expanding. Originally it was just about military stuff. Then it was about stuff to support the military. Now it's saying, well, we can't really have a good military without these resources and without money. So again, Qing people are willing to reform. One thing about this guy, he was a great diplomat. We'll talk a little bit later about this, but there's a war between China and Japan where China just gets trounced. It's called the First Sino-Japanese War. We'll talk about it later. And he has to go to Japan to negotiate a treaty. And a crazy Japanese guy, and I think literally the guy was crazy. I mean, he was insane. A Japanese guy shot him in the face. So this Japanese guy just walks up and shoots Li Hongzhang in the face. Now, Li Hongzhang was fortunate, it hit his cheekbone, and the bullet was a small caliber bullet, so it just flattened against his cheekbone. So he had a bullet here. But he was an old man, so they didn't want to take out the bullet because they were afraid it would kill him. Right? You know, we'll just leave the bullet in there because if we have an operation, it's going to cause problems. So the negotiations went on, and he insisted that despite being, shot in the face, that he still negotiate. And whenever the Japanese were like too strict on China and too harsh, he would do this, where they'd shot him, and then the Japanese would back off. So this guy was a genius. Right? One of my favorite things, Annie, who we've mentioned before, she told me that after he was shot, the Japanese lowered the amount of money that China had to pay, and supposedly he said, if you want to shoot me again and lower the money even more, I'm fine with that. Right? So I love Li Hongzhang. He's an awesome guy. I mean, that's tough, right? Someone shoots you in the face and you still go to work. Right? Tough guy. What's interesting, though, too, is under him, China will start learning another thing from the West, and that's imperialism. Before this time period, China took a really hands-off approach to Korea. Korea was an independent country. It was a little brother country, but it was independent. Koreans kind of did their own thing. It was an independent country. But during this time period, China will expand its influence into Korea in ways very similar to the ways that Western European countries were expanding their influence and power into China. Right? So China's also learning how to be an imperial power. He also will help build the Navy. Right? He's also going to help build the Navy. So he's doing a lot of really cool stuff. Now the problem, though, is that Li is fundamentally an able officer, an official, serving a decaying order. There's a very deep rot. You may recall that Lord Macartney said that one day, China's going to fall apart. It's being kept afloat by able emperors. I would add able officials. Li Hongzhang's one of those officials, but there's just only so much this guy can do. Right? There's structural problems. So to give you an example, in 1884 to 1885, there's a war between China and France over Vietnam. Right? China historically had influence in Vietnam. France was expanding its influence in Vietnam, so they have a war. In the war, the Southern Fleet is destroyed. The Chinese Southern Fleet is destroyed. They use 9 of 11 ships with no French losses. That's not good. Right? That's not good. 10 years later, in 1894 to 1895, they're defeated in a war with Japan, and their Northern Fleet is destroyed. Now that's bad enough, but let me explain something else that shows us it's a problem. During this war, the Southern Fleet asked the Northern Fleet for help. The Southern Fleet said, Northern Fleet, can you come down and help us? We're fighting the French, let's concentrate our Navy. The Northern Fleet refused to help. 10 years later, the situation was reversed. The Northern Fleet said, Southern Fleet, can you please come up and help us? We're at war with Japan. The Southern Fleet said, yeah, about that. Remember what happened 10 years ago? You guys are on your own. Now, can you imagine American troops refusing to help each other in this kind of situation? Right? Can you imagine that? It's hard to, right? We're supposed to be patriotic. I may hate this other guy, but I got to help him, right? He's a fellow American. This shows us the lack of nationalism. The Chinese in the North said, whatever happens in the South, that affects people in the South. Who cares about them? Chinese in the South said, who cares about what happens to Chinese in the North? Doesn't affect me. Now you may ask yourself, you can say, look, why don't you have a supreme naval command? Right? If you're a military history person, that's probably what popped in your head. Why not just have a supreme naval command? The answer is simple. you have a supreme naval command, that's one person who has too much power, they might overthrow the emperor. That's why they don't have a single person unifying both fleets. Can you imagine, again, if the American president or any political leader had to make military decisions based on the fear of being overthrown if they give one general too much power? Like Abraham Lincoln did not have to worry about Ulysses S. Grant overthrowing him. Jefferson Davis did not have to worry about Robert E. Lee. Thank you. I'm from the north, sorry. But Robert E. Lee trying to overthrow him, right? You just don't think about that. But the Qing had to think about that because they lacked nationalism. One other example, two other quick examples. They can't reform enough. They don't actually build that many railroads because the problem is if you build railroads, the people who traditionally move stuff will go out of business and they just bribe officials and they oppose the railroads. Right? So people who traditionally moved goods say, we don't want the railroads because we'll go out of business. And they just bribe officials and then they oppose the railroads and railroads don't get built. In one case, there was a railroad that was built by like the British, I think. The Chinese government bought it back and tore it up because it would challenge the old way of doing things too much. The other one, and this is really shocking, this also goes to the issue of nationalism. When the Chinese and the Japanese were at war with each other in the naval battles, you know, they didn't shoot cannonballs, they shot shells. If you're not familiar with what a shell is like a projectile full of gunpowder. Right? Cannonball hits something, it makes a hole. But a shell hits something and it explodes. When the Japanese ships shot the Chinese ships, their shells exploded. When the Chinese ships shot Japanese ships, sometimes the shells exploded, other times they did not. The reason they did not was because they were full of sand. Because corrupt officials had taken the gunpowder out and sold it. So that's a fundamental difference. The Japanese were nationalists, patriots, who were fighting for the good of Japan. They wouldn't do that kind of thing. But in China, there was still such a lack of unified feeling among the Chinese that they were willing to sell out their own soldiers. Right? You had officials who were willing to sell gunpowder and then replace it with sand. So this is a terrible situation. So there are fundamentally amazing people like Li Hongzhang, like Zheng Guofan, and even Xi was brilliant in her way. But China has some deep problems, some very deep problems. We'll pick up with those deep problems and how they get even deeper on Friday.
Poor China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.